Well, hello, everyone. I'm joined now by Chris Andrews, who's a professor at Western Sydney University and translator from the Spanish. He's translated at least 9 books by Roberto Bolaño and at least as many by César Aira, as well as other works. In addition, he's a poet and has a couple of years ago written a work on Roberto Bolaño's prose. But today we're here to talk about translation. So it is tomorrow in Sydney right now. And thank you so much for joining me, Chris.
It's
And
a
I'm
pleasure.
curious to start off your background with the Spanish language.
Sure. Well, I studied Spanish at Melbourne University as an undergraduate back in the 80s, the end of the 80s, and then I was working after that. So I went on. I did a PhD, but in French. And then I worked in the French program at Melbourne University, began in 1995, but I'd always wanted to translate. And it just took me a while to get the contracts. You know, it's tricky to get a first contract. It's especially tricky in Australia because there are not many publishing companies who commission translations here. So I got a couple of contracts to translate non-fiction books, travel narratives, one by Luis Sepulveda and one by Ana Briongos. They were for the Melbourne-based travel book company Lonely Planet. So they were my first translations from Spanish. And then in the early 2000s, I started looking a bit more seriously to get fiction translation work, and I was very lucky. One of the early things that I got to do then was By Night in Chile by Bolaño.
And how did you first encounter Bolaño?
Actually, traveling. So in 2001, I was in Chile. I was traveling, and I was going to bookstores and actually talking with booksellers and, you know, asking them what was interesting. And so the first book I bought, I just pulled it off the shelf before, was this edition of The Savage Detectives, which I got in Chile in 2001. And just from the first pages, I was really completely drawn in by the voice of the young narrator of that book. So that's where I began with Bolaño. Yeah,
That's where I began too, though not in Spanish in Chile. But I remember I finished The Savage Detectives and I put the book down and I drove to the nearest bookstore and I bought every Bolaño title they had on the shelf.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
So I put together a stack of all the books of yours, all your translations that I have. It's quite a few. And for anyone listening who's not familiar with Roberto Bolaño, maybe we could introduce him a little bit. He's become something of an international publishing phenomenon. A lot of that posthumously, at least in English. So he's a Chilean writer,
Yeah,
who lived as a young man in Mexico. He was in exile from Chile after the coup, and then lived as an adult in Spain, which is, I believe, where he did almost all of his writing.
yeah. Although that's right. He was writing and publishing poems in Mexico before he moved to Spain. Yeah, but he didn't start really seriously writing fiction until a bit later on. Yeah.
And so I'm curious about his Spanish. So he grew up in Chile, lived as a young man in
in
Mexico and then wrote his novels in Spain. And then it's clear from both his fiction and his essays that he was widely read, knew the Spanish, the Hispanophone literary canon as well as anyone. And so I'm curious about his Spanish.
Yeah, so his Spanish is a kind of a blend, really, of, you know, there are, when you listen to the interviews and hear him speak, there are moments that sound Mexican, there are moments that sound Chilean, and moments that sound Spanish. And in one of the great attractions of the Savage Detectives is the dialectal variation in the book, because you've got all those first person monologues, and, you know, often someone will start speaking in that novel and identify themselves as coming from, say, Peru or Mexico by the way they speak, and that's, you know, that's something that's really difficult to catch in translation. And I think inevitably the effect is slightly different. It takes you slightly longer to work out where people are from when you're reading it in translation than it does if you're reading it in Spanish. Yeah, so his Spanish was, you know, like the English of somebody who's migrated from Britain to America or from Australia to America in adulthood. It was a kind of a mix.
How much continuity is there between the Spanish of Chile and the Spanish of Spain?
Oh, there's a lot of difference. I mean, there's, you know, it's except for kind of you know, linguistic accidents, it's mutually comprehensible. But, you know, the intonation of Chilean Spanish is very particular, very different from the Spanish of Spain, even very different from across the border in Argentina. So yeah, and then there are grammatical differences, and lots of vocabulary differences, lots of little things that are characteristically Chilean words. Yeah.
And you've translated a lot of novellas by the Argentinian César Aira, who's still alive. And if anyone out there has never read one of these short books by César Aira, they're utterly delightful. I don't know that he's stands alone. I think it is almost invented a genre of writing in my mind.
Yeah.
And so Bolaño has this varied Spanish. You're translating Aira's Argentinian Spanish. But in some ways, César Aira reads to me as if he comes from another planet in the best sense. And you learn Spanish in Australia, and I'm curious about how you approach that as a translator. Have you
Sure.
stretched your own language ability and become acclimated to these different dialects, and how that comes through in your English and how you render them in English?
Yeah, well, when we, you know, at the University of Melbourne, when I was learning Spanish, most of the teachers were from the Southern Cone, so from Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, and that's really for political reasons, because, you know, after the coups in the 70s, there were lots of migrants from the Southern Cone to Australia. It was a time when Australia was receiving immigrants much more generously than now. And so the accents that we heard, and even some of the vocabulary, were Southern South American Spanish mainly. But you still have to, as a translator, you still have to train yourself in regional varieties, and consult with people and use specialist glossaries and dictionaries. Yeah, definitely both for César Aira and for Bolaño, there are things that required research. Yeah, yeah, and help.
If you could throw throw your mind back to translating Benight in Chile.
Mm.
It's a formally interesting novel. It's written sort of like a Thomas Bernhard novel without punctuation, and you sort of started in the deep end,
Yes,
as it
yeah,
were. And so I'm
yeah.
curious about it. That was your first attempt at literary translation, or at least published literary translation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, what that experience was like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd done it was the first fiction, I think it was the first fiction book. I might have done a detective novel before that. It was very challenging because there are these very long, syntactically complex sentences. It's hard for me to remember back to what it was like. I remember I was working fairly quickly because the book had been, the way I got the book was that it had been, the rights to it had been bought by Harville in England, and they had a translator lined up to do it. And the translator had then pulled out. So I had to step in. They had it in the catalogue, so that the date was fairly tight. So I had to work pretty quickly. I remember it was exciting. It was kind of intoxicating doing it in that concentrated way. But I guess that it was the same sort of process that most translators follow, which is you knock out a first version of the paragraph or the page, and it's pretty rough around the edges still. But you hope, for example, that you've got basically the right shape for the sentence. You might be adjusting some of the lexical choices later on, and then what I did was to go right through the whole thing and get a first draft that was sort of okay in place, and then go back through it many times. I mean, one thing, just thinking about research, I don't know why I remember this, but there was, he uses the word somewhere, mejorales, which is a brand of analgesic, which is specific to Chile, and I think, and so I had to do some research to get that. Yeah, sorry, it's a while ago now. It's the early 2000s that I was doing that. So
Sure. And it's an interesting, I don't know if you talk about approaching it on the level of sentence and paragraph. And part of the reason that book, I imagine, would be really difficult to translate is that it doesn't break down into those chunks.
Yeah.
As easily as most do. The sentence just keeps going and going and going.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the interesting formal features of that book is really that there is one paragraph, and then there is one line at the very end. So there's only one paragraph break on the final page. Yeah, so it's got this headlong, tumbling out quality that it was important to try to preserve. But
it's shockingly readable. That,
yeah.
I mean, that it doesn't feel like you're stuck in a kind of nerdy literary experiment.
No, I don't think Bolaño ever feels like that, even in a book like Nazi Literature in the Americas, which is extremely kind of meta literary and full of games and winks and allusions. It still has this energy that carries you along, and that it still has the thing that I found on the first page of The Savage Detectives, and which is, I think, the thing that addicts people to Bolaño's prose really, really quickly. An energy, a kind of vibration that is hard to account for in formal terms. And I mean, I sort of tried to in critical writing about Bolaño, but I don't really think I gave a full account of why it is that it grabs you and holds you in that way.
I think he ends paragraphs really well.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
He oftentimes has these astonishing sentences at the ends of paragraphs that give the prose, make it really propulsive.
Yeah, yeah.
So what in let's just start with Bolaño. What I've been translating Bible. I was recently talking to Matthew Dean, who translates contemporary Chinese political philosophy, and before that I was talking to Everett Fox, who's also a Bible translator. And one of the questions I asked both of them and received very different answers is, what is at stake in your translation? So translating Bible, okay, what are the stakes of that? Quite high, depending on who you are. And translating Chinese political philosophy, also quite high. I think the stakes, the different political stakes. And Bolaño took literature very seriously as a way of life and a way of thinking, and so and his characters do too. And so I'm curious, what for you as a reader, in which you were a reader of Bolaño before you were a translator, and now as a translator, what are the stakes in translating him?
I guess to preserve the qualities of the experience of reading the original as much as possible. So I guess, you know, you could resort to a concept that's big in Bible translation, which is that the concept of functional equivalence. You're wanting the text to function for the reader of the translation very similarly to the way it functions for the reader of the original. And of course, there are always going to be losses and shifts. It's never going to be exactly the same. But sometimes that requires you to depart from denotative meaning a bit boldly. Sometimes you have to take a bit of a risk. At the moment, I'm working on a book by César Aira, and there's a wordplay right near the end of it, where the narrator uses the word or the expression "no me gustaría," I wouldn't like it, or it wouldn't be pleasant for me, and then thinks, oh, that gustaría sounds like angustiaría, it would distress me. And then he has a little reflection on the similarity. You know, there's only a few letters difference between gustaría and angustiaría. And so I have to put something there that is wordplay, and that has a little reflection on it. But the words also have to relate to the situation, which is somebody who's in love, and the woman has just left, and he hasn't said what he wanted to say before she went away. So I'm really, you know, I haven't got a good solution yet. I'm thinking about languish, anguish. I don't know. But the thing that I will finally run past the author when I've got something that I think works, it's going to be fairly different in in terms of dictionary equivalence from what's in the original. But I think I have to do that, because you know there's that moment in the text which is a moment of, it's a kind of playful moment, but also a horribly distressing moment. It's a narrator who can't stop himself noticing the similarities between words, even as his life is falling apart.
What's the difference? Oh, please go ahead.
Sorry, that was a roundabout answer to, you know, what's at stake. What's at stake in that case is the effect, is the kind of global effect of that sentence. Sorry.
I guess I'm curious about what's at stake for you personally. What drew you to literary translation in the first place,
Sure,
and
yeah.
keeps you doing it. And yeah, what does that take for you personally in translating these works?
I really enjoy the prolonged immersion in works of literature that I admire. So it's, in a way, it's an excuse to reread, and to reread really slowly. So there's that. There's going very deeply into the original text, and sometimes that gives you the feeling that you have a kind of X-ray vision. Maybe it's an illusion, but you sometimes feel. With Bolaño, for example, I felt with the stories that I had that translating was helping me to see how they worked as little narrative mechanisms, and they're very, very cunning. They flow beautifully. They look really artless, but they're super clever. And then there's the pleasure of just dithering over word choice and sentence shape, and that's a pleasure that relates really to the target language a lot. Looking things up in the thesaurus, weighing up a choice between two words. Which one, even if they mean pretty much the same thing, which one sounds better in that sonic context. That stuff. No, I really. So that's two things, I guess. There's prolonging the experience of immersion in the original, playing with linguistic resources in the target language. A third thing might be exploring, looking for new things to translate as well. Prospecting, that's a lot of fun as well.
Are there any Spanish language writers we who unfortunately can't read Spanish should keep our eyes open for if they are translated in the future?
Yeah,
Can you give us just a couple names?
Sure. Well, one who a book that's come out just recently in English translation, and that is it's kind of deeply related to Bolaño, I think, is a Chilean poet by Alejandro Zambra, Chilean writer, fantastic Chilean writer. It's his biggest book. I think it's great. Translated by Megan McDowell. So I would definitely recommend that.
And how about something that hasn't been, an author who hasn't been translated yet?
Hasn't been translated yet. Let me think. A good, one who I think is really good, who hasn't been translated yet, is Luciano Lamberti from Argentina, the writer of short stories and novels, who moves into the territory of horror and terror a bit, and that's a bit of a strain in contemporary Latin American writing. So there are some very good writers like Mariana Enriquez, who has been translated, who's really, really good, who does that. Liliana Colanzi a bit as well, the Bolivian writer. I think she's wonderful. So yeah, there are lots coming up. Their visibility comes in waves a bit, depending on how the winds are blowing in the publishing world. But that you can't stop the writers producing good stuff.
And you write original poetry in English. Have you done any translation of poetry?
A little bit, but really just for. I've been to a couple of translation festivals, poetry translation festivals, and that was really. So I don't think it runs anymore, but it was a French English poetry festival which ran in Paris for many years, and then there was one edition of it in Montreal, and so it was a bit like the poetry translation workshop as it's developed in the US, where people sit around a table, or they bring their translations along and they discuss them with the author. So it was really, really interesting. But I translated a dozen poems or something. Nothing very major. I haven't done a book.
And being able to sit and talk about a translation with an author, I'm curious about the difference between translating the works of an author who's no longer living
Yeah.
and translating the works of Ira, for example, whom you presumably could call on the phone tomorrow when you if you
Yeah.
came across a sentence that was difficult.
I guess I could. I mean, I haven't called him on the phone. We have email exchanges, and I've met him and had chats, but um, I it's great to be able to ask questions of a living author. I really that's a really precious resource for a translator. But at the same time, I'm quite conscious of um, not being in their ear all the time. I think, especially one thing with living authors, especially when they've got a certain degree of success in translation, is that when they're being translated into English, it's usually after being translated into half a dozen other languages. So they've dealt with their translators from Italian and Turkish and whatever already when you're asking your questions. And so I like to save them up for the end and ask them in one batch. But it's really interesting to get the responses, and and often I think, oh gosh, I'm glad I asked about that. Yeah, I could have done something bad there if I hadn't asked. So it's great to ask. With Bolaño, his friends were really helpful. Some of his friends were really helpful after his death. People who knew his work well, who'd known him for many years. Yeah.
Are living authors trustworthy sources on
That's a
their own
good
work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that I wouldn't be doubting them on what they meant to say at a particular place in the text. But I guess if they're the living author who wants to offer a solution in the target language, then you know you might not always agree. I haven't translated anyone like that. The people. So Bolaño was like super generous with his responses, which were just to a couple of books, because he died in 2003. But I remember I asked him about something in a short story. There was an expression that I really couldn't understand, a metaphorical expression, and his response was not so much a gloss on the sentence, but like it was like a 4-sentence version of the same thing in the same style. So it was like his way of explaining what he'd meant in that sentence was to go back and add 4 sentences to the original story. So I mean, and that did actually influence the translation. So the translation kind of adds something, but it adds something from Bolaño himself in an email. And thinking about that later, I thought, that's the way his mind worked. He generated his fiction by expanding stories from within. So the short novel Distant Star is an expansion of the last story in Nazi literature in the Americas. And when you put them side by side, you can see that Distant Star is really like an explosion. It's like the fragments of this short story are still there, even down to the details of the sentence. But in between the fragments, there's new material.
Amulet is the same way.
Yeah, and Amulet as well. Yeah, expanded from a chapter in The Savage Detectives.
Yeah,
So
and
that was,
it almost gives the impression that it's all one book.
yeah. Well, I think from Nazi literature in the Americas onwards, there's a real sense in which it is all one book. Yeah, I think it's a real thing.
So this isn't a translation question, but I have to ask because of all the people who would have an interesting answer to this. He has that famous or infamous note about 2666 about how the narrator is Arturo Belano.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious what you make of that.
Of that.
So to preface this question for anyone who's unfamiliar with these things, 2666 was a posthumously published novel by Bolaño. It's his largest work by far. It's impossible to paraphrase the plot of it,
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. But Arturo Bolaño is a recurring character throughout his fiction that is roughly a stand-in for himself. It's a change of spelling of his own name. But this character does not appear, at least explicitly, in 2666 at all. And yet we have this note from Bolaño. I believe it's a note he left with the manuscript saying that the narrator of that novel is Arturo Bolaño. So there's my long-winded explanation. The reality is, if you're listening to this, you need to just go out and read 2666 in Spanish or English, however you can get it. Okay, that preface over. Yeah, what do you make of that note?
Well, I think that relates to what you were just saying about it being all the one book. I think it's a way of, it's a very dizzying way of embedding the biggest part of the body of work in the life of a character who'd been introduced. I can't right back at the beginning, right back at with Distant Star. So I think the prologue to Distant Star is the first place that Arturo Belano gets fully named. So it's part of building this very intricate web, which is, in a way, it's a bid for reader loyalty, connecting everything up in that way. Stylistically, the 2666 is, in a way, it's a more austere book than some of the others. There's not much of the kind of syntactic fireworks you get in By Night in Chile. It's quite plainly written in some ways. It's very big, but it's in a way it's very quick to read. I mean, it's traumatic to read as well, because there's the part about the crimes, which is deliberately kind of numbing in its repetition of the descriptions of bodies of young women who've been found in this city called Santa Teresa in the novel, but which is based on Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, on the Mexican-US border. But I don't know how you found reading it, but I found reading it very, it had that propulsive force that you were talking about before, turned right up. And the only thing, when I reread it to write about it, I remember thinking before I started, oh, I'm going to have to read the part about the crimes again. It's like entering a long dark tunnel. But actually, when I reread it, I saw things in that part that had been completely invisible on a first and a second reading. So yeah, it's a wonderful book.
I've read it 3 or 4 times now, and the part about the crimes doesn't get easier. I am fascinated by the Juarez. Juarez actually appears in the novel as a different city, and so I'm fascinated by that. That Bolaño writes, he was clearly inspired by reading about Juarez.
Yeah,
he says that himself. There's no doubt, but the Santa Teresa in the novel is a distinct place.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could talk for hours just about that book. So translating Aira, translating Bolaño. You've also translated novella by Rodrigo Ray. Did I get his
Rodrigo
name correct?
Rosa. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if you could introduce, of the three, I think his work is the least translated. It
Yeah,
seems, or
probably.
there are fewer of his books, and so I wonder if you can, and he's the least well known, I should say. So I wonder if you could introduce him a little bit, and what led you to translate him.
Sure. Well, he's a Guatemalan novelist, and a writer of very spare, elliptical, often quite mysterious novels. I can't remember what the first one was that I read. Short stories as well. I mean, he began as a short story writer. He has an interesting trajectory because he left Guatemala during the very long civil conflict in Guatemala, went and lived in New York, and then went to Morocco, where he was a student of Paul Bowles in Tangiers. And Paul Bowles actually, who was an old man at the time, he actually was impressed by the stuff that Rodrigo Ray Rosa was writing for the workshop, and asked if he could translate some of it, because a magazine had asked if he had anything to publish, and he said no, but there are these stories that I could translate. So he was Ray Rosa's first translator, and then Ray Rosa has translated a lot of Paul Bowles' work into Spanish. One of the books that I really that really struck me by Ray Rosa was a book called The African Shore, which has been translated by Geoffrey Gray, which is a really wonderful book about Tangiers. The one I did was called Severina, which is a very Borgesian story about a mysterious woman who steals books from a shop in Guatemala City. So he's less well known than Aira and Bolaño, but he's going strong, and I think there's a new translation going to come out soon in Canada. I just can't. I would have to look that up. But he's definitely somebody to watch for. A book of his called Human Material has also been translated, I think, by the university, published by the University of Texas Press. That's a fantastic book too, about the archive of the secret police in Guatemala, and the narrator is investigating the archive, and which is a dangerous activity. So I think one of the things that distinguishes him is that he's an expert in creating an enigmatic gap in the narrative. And in each book is an experiment in fictional method. So there's one called The Good Cripple, which Esther Allen translated, which does a backwards thing, which inverts the order of events in a very interesting way. Yeah, I would recommend him very highly to anyone who's listening. Yeah,
It's an old question whether it's possible to teach someone how to write, and we can leave that question aside. But I'm curious if you think it's possible to teach someone how to translate.
Okay, well, I have taught translation a bit, but not literary translation. So the translation I've taught is community translation. So things like, community documents, what most translators do to earn a living, which is, documents, medical and legal stuff. And that was an interesting experience, partly because it was sort of humbling, in the sense that, the group would have a document to translate, and I would often, I would have to grade their translations. But when I was giving them back, I would often compose a kind of model of what I thought a good translation was, putting together things that different people had written. And it seemed to be the case that it was hardly ever the case that one person had the best translation overall. The best translation was usually something that was an aggregate of solutions found by 5, 6, 7 people. So that was a humbling thing to remember for a translator. But you're not necessarily, as an individual, going to be capable of finding the best solution for all the problems in a text. I think you can, that kind of translation you can teach fairly effectively by guiding people towards the best resources, which aren't always obvious. In literary translation, it's a little bit different, because I think that the translator, even if their presence is discreet, they end up setting a kind of stylistic stamp on the work. And they need to have a feeling for words and a confidence in their feeling for words as well. So that's getting harder to teach. That's getting closer to what makes somebody a good writer.
What is your stylistic stamp?
That would be hard to say. Probably, I mean, there are probably things that you end up leaving on the translation that relate to where you are in the world of the target language. So, being an Australian, I probably end up sounding a bit Australian here and there. I've mainly worked for American and British publishing companies, and so you end up, going one way or the other. But there are always things that you can't see in your own translation. There's always something, even if it's the choice of a preposition or something that is distinctively, or that will seem distinctively British to an American reader, but that might be something that I would use here in Australia. Otherwise, stylistically, well, sometimes you're battling against your own pet words too. I mean, I think you sometimes notice that you have a pet word. One word that I've noticed I overuse a bit is prompt, and so now I've got a campaign against prompt. Prompt as a verb, not as an adjective.
It's a particular feeling of dread when you discover you have one of those.
Yeah.
Like I discovered that the verbal phrase map onto, something, mapping onto something else, for whatever reason, I was fixated on that phrase.
Yeah.
And it was a horrible feeling, because then you notice that you use it everywhere, whatever your word or phrase is.
Yeah. But once you've noticed it, then in a way you're saved, because
yes,
you've had that feeling of slight shame, but then in the future you're going to be wary.
Mortal dread even. You mentioned that sometimes the best translation resources aren't the obvious ones. I wonder if you could give an example or two of that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think now that in the old days with paper dictionaries, you bought the best ones you could afford, and you had maybe 2 or 3 really good ones. Now with the internet, there's a lot. Your access to dictionaries, including good free ones, is vastly increased. So it's probably important to remember to keep checking the other ones rather than the one that's just kind of there in your operating system. For example, on the computer I've got here, I've got a very good Spanish English dictionary that's just sitting in the dictionary app thing. But it's good to keep opening up all the other ones as well, to be looking at specialized glossaries and dictionaries, and a resource that I think is great, and that I used to tell students to use, is the word reference forums on. Do you know word reference?
No.
It's a, I don't know if they have classical languages in word reference. It might just be modern languages, but it's a kind of forum for translators, and they ask each other questions, and they, so there's a long archive of these things, and so you can look for help with understanding expressions, and it's the same with all these internet resources. There are bad answers and good answers, but if you look at lots of answers, it can, I was going to say it can prompt some good solutions, but I shouldn't say that.
One of my favorite resources like that is, I'm always fascinated to read, there are these forums for learners of English as a second language, where people will, in shocking detail, work their way through English idioms and phrases and try to figure out what they mean and the proper syntax and how they work.
Yeah.
And it's delightful. I mean, learning language is a fascinating process, but to watch people learn the language in which you are a native speaker and work their way through, you learn a lot that you otherwise take for granted. I found those endlessly interesting, especially for more idiomatic phrases.
Yeah. You see just how non-intuitive the meaning of so many idiomatic phrases is if you're coming to them from the outside. That's word reference forums are really similar to that. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to explore.
Yeah, it's worth a look.
Explore
really
that.
Is. Yeah.
What is your favorite reference work?
Oh, gosh. I don't know what my favorite. I'm just looking at my shelves to see if I can. Now here's a really left field answer, but I'll show it to you. Since,
yeah, please.
This is by Denise Rocky. It's called Phonetic Lexicon. And Denise Rocky was a linguist, but basically I think a speech therapist in Australia. And she wrote this phonetic lexicon, which is basically a series of charts of all the monosyllabic words in the English language. So you've got, I don't know if you can see it, but
incredible.
Charts like this. And I just find this book really fascinating, partly because it shows you, how some parts of the phonetic space are densely populated and some parts are really quite empty. And if you're interested in playing with words, so there's like an empty part of the phonetic space, and others are really quite full. It's not a rhyming dictionary, but it has some of the same attraction. I don't really use it for translating, but I just love it as a book. So there it is, Denise Rocky's Phonetic Lexicon.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think that there's older reference works I find can be delightfully written. So for any student of biblical Hebrew will get a copy of BDB, Brown Drivers Briggs. It's the old lexicon. It's in the public domain, and so you can get affordable copies of it. And it's an old lexicon. And I toyed with the idea for a while of creating a blog or something that was just the best of BDB, because I found some of the phrasing they'd use in definitions so delightful.
Yeah.
Versus more modern lexicons are way more thorough.
Yeah.
And linguistically sophisticated, but they aren't fun to read.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a way, some of the old ones are. But that one, that sound, I've never even heard of someone doing something like that. It's what an amazing project. I can only imagine the amount of time
Yeah. Yeah.
she poured into it.
And I think she really, the motivation really was to work on speech problems, to have a resource for speech therapists. But it's super interesting for, you know, for anyone who's really interested in the English language, and especially on the monosyllabic ground of the English language, you know, all those monosyllables.
Yeah. Has there ever been either a work or a particular phrase or paragraph in a work that you felt defeated by as a translator? You just had to throw up your hands and walk away, or put something in that you knew wasn't quite it?
Wasn't quite it. Well, I can't think of one. You know, at the moment I'm feeling defeated by gustaría, angustiaría, the example I gave you before. But then, you know, it's always like that with a translation. There's always something that looks impossible, and often it's not as obviously difficult as that. Often it's something that doesn't even look difficult in the original, but you put the sentence into English and it just doesn't work at all. It's quite a plain looking sentence in the source language. So then you chip away at it and you leave it and you come back later, and I can't think of I can't think of something that. There are probably things that I thought, well, after chipping away, well, that's my best shot. You know, I can still see how it falls short, but it really is my best shot. But
On the
I don't.
flip side, what is a solution you found in translating work that you're particularly pleased with?
Actually, I think I've got an answer to your previous question rather than that question. So in a book called How I Became a Nun by César Aira. So in the first chapter of that book, so it's a book where there's the main character who's speaking in the first person. It's a kind of trans novel. The main character speaks about herself as a girl, but the main character's father refers to him as a boy. So as a reader, you're not quite sure what's going on.
Is this the one that begins with the ice cream scene?
With the ice cream, yeah.
Okay.
But the gender ambivalence is much more. There are many more gender markers in Spanish than in English. So you get these little kind of pings of bewilderment or confusion as you're reading it in Spanish. You know, maybe I counted them. I think there are maybe 9 or 10 in the first chapter. In the English, what I had to do was I had to actually introduce some lexical items like son in the father's speech in order to indicate that he thought that the child was a boy. But I couldn't do that as there are only so many places where I could do that. So instead of having 9 or 10 little pings, you have 2 or 3 sort of louder, clunkier noises. And so that was a case where I thought, well, and then I ran that past the author because he was, of course, curious to know what had been done with this experiment. And in that case, I thought, I've got something. You've still got the gender ambiguity there, but the effect of it is qualitatively quite different. So I chipped away, but there was still a loss in there. I can't, to answer the other question, I can't really. I can't, off the top of my head, think of anything that I'm really satisfied with. I mean, usually you hope that it will, if you have got something satisfying, that it will sort of vanish into the texture of the work, and that it won't stand out as a clever solution. So that's the problem with the gustaría, angustiaría. I don't want it to. I don't want it to look so kind of showy that the reader's going to be thinking, oh yeah, there must have been some clever bit of wordplay in the original, and this is what he's had to do to substitute for it. I'd rather that they think about the wordplay itself rather than thinking about the performance of the translator. But yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do with that.
Which book was the most fun to translate?
Oh, I've enjoyed them all. Amulet was a dream to translate, and Distant Star as well, because it's so compelling, so creepy. I mean, it's an upsetting book. It's a disturbing book. Emma the Captive by Aira, which is a completely crazy book, was a lot of fun to translate. And there are still scenes from that book that come back to me very vividly when I think about it. No, I think they've all been really a great pleasure, a deep pleasure to translate. The book I translated a book by Selva Almada called "The Wind That Lays Waste," and that was a great pleasure to translate. It's a wonderful book.
How has translating changed the way you write poetry, and vice versa?
That's hard to answer. It's hard. It's really hard to know. I guess maybe translating authors as bold as Aira and Bolaño is in a very general way an encouragement to take a few risks. And maybe to allow a piece of writing or a poem to change direction in midway through or part of the way through. That's something. How writing poetry is affected how I translate. I'm not sure. I mean, definitely being a reader of poetry is one of the things that drew me to Bolaño in the first place. And Aira too. I think he often jokes that he has that his writing is prosaic, that he doesn't have a feeling for the texture of language. I think that's just self-deprecation, really. I think his writing is very poetic, and he's definitely a big reader of poetry. Yeah. So it's hard to give specific answer to that question.
Sure. Bolaño's poem "Godzilla in Mexico City," I think that's the title of it, has always stayed with me. It's almost it sort of captures all of the things that he
Mm, mm.
does in his writing, but in a single poem. Um, so this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, and thank you for all the hours you've spent making these wonderful books available in English. If anyone out there listening hasn't read the books we're talking about, probably the easiest way to get started is to, for Americans anyway, is to go through the catalog of the publisher New Directions, who have published most of the books, not all that we've talked about, but certainly the Aira and Bolaño books. And if nothing else, the ice cream scene we mentioned at the beginning of How I Became a Nun is one of the most unbelievable and amazing scenes ever written
Yeah,
in the history of literature. It's jaw dropping, and that is it's a good reminder to reread that book. It's a very strange book.
it's very strange. Yeah,
Even for Ira, it's a strange
yeah,
book.
yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, yeah. He was really on fire when he wrote that. Yeah, yeah.
And Ira, I guess, claims that he writes his book 1 page a day. That's his method.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've ever tried to translate him at that pace.
I think I probably translate a bit more slowly than he writes, because I have to go back and and fix things up. Whereas one of the features of his method is that he fixes things up by retrospective explanation. So he adds something new to explain the weirdnesses of what's gone before, and that pushes him into some weird, some new weird corners. Yeah. So he's there's just a new one's just come out in Spanish. So he's unstoppable. He just keeps going.
Yeah, I like to think that there's going to be an Ira novel for me to read every year for the rest of my life, because I'm behind enough in his back catalog, and he keeps making more at such a pace that there will always be new Ira writing for the rest of my days.
There are more in the pipeline at the moment. Yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.